He thought he could silence her by burning her ID. He didn't know who she was. The low hum of the highway filled the quiet of the car as Brianna adjusted her rearview mirror. She was tired, but it was the good kind of tired. The kind that came after a productive day at work, knowing she'd given it her all. It had been a long shift at the law firm, but her mind wasn't on court cases or deadlines anymore. It was on her 2 kids waiting at home and the macaroni and cheese she'd promised them for dinner. She smiled at the thought of her youngest trying to help her in the kitchen, likely making a mess of flour and noodles. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and oranges. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 6:43 p.m. With only 10 minutes to go before she'd reach her house in Bakersfield, California, Brianna exhaled a small sigh of relief. Dinner, a little TV with the kids, and finally some rest. That was the plan. But something about the road ahead caught her eye. The intersection she was approaching seemed unusually quiet for this time of night. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, though she brushed off the feeling. Maybe it was just her nerves after a long day. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on her mental checklist for tomorrow. Then, in the corner of her mirror, she saw it. Flashing red and blue lights. Her stomach sank. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light, hadn't done anything to warrant being pulled over. Yet, here she was, slowing down and pulling over to the side of the road. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned on her hazard lights and rolled down her window. Brianna wasn't new to being stopped by the police. She'd had her fair share of random checks before. She always kept her documents in order, and her demeanor calm, knowing all too well how easily things could escalate. But this time, something felt different. Heavier. As she waited, she could see the officer stepping out of his cruiser. His figure was silhouetted against the flashing lights, his movements deliberate and slow. Brianna took a deep breath, steadying herself for whatever was about to come. But the way he approached her car, with that deliberate slowness, sent a ripple of unease through her. The officer approached Brianna's car with measured steps, his flashlight pointed directly at her face. She squinted against the glare, trying to maintain her composure as he stopped by her window. He didn't speak right away, letting the silence hang in the air before finally asking, "License and registration?" His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or professionalism. Brianna nodded, careful to move slowly as she reached into her purse and glove compartment. She handed him the documents, her hands steady despite the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. "Here you go, officer," she said, her voice calm and respectful. He barely glanced at her before taking the papers and retreating to his cruiser. Brianna exhaled, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She watched him through her side mirror as he lingered in his car, longer than seemed necessary. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in her chest grew heavier with each passing second. When he finally returned, his demeanor had shifted. His posture was rigid, his expression hard. He waved her ID in the air, his brow furrowed. "This doesn't look right," he said, his tone accusatory. "Are you sure this is yours?" Brianna blinked, confused. "Yes, sir, that's my ID," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "It's valid and up to date. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to—" He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "We'll see about that." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "What's someone like you doing in this area?" Her heart skipped a beat. "Someone like me?" she echoed, her voice softer now. The implication in his words stung, but she kept her composure. "Officer, I'm heading home to my family. I haven't broken any laws." He stepped back, his hand gripping the ID tightly. For a moment it looked like he might say something else, but instead he smirked, a cold, dismissive expression that sent a chill through her. "Wait here," he said, turning back toward his cruiser. Brianna's mind raced as she sat there, gripping the wheel tightly. This wasn't about a traffic violation. She knew that much. The officer's tone, his behavior, it was something else entirely. Still, She reminded herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help. But when he returned, she realized this was about to go far beyond anything she'd imagined. The officer returned, but this time his face was set in a hardened scowl, and the flashlight in his hand seemed like a weapon more than a tool. Brianna rolled her window down further, trying to maintain her calm, even as her heart thudded in her chest. He held her ID in one hand, waving it slightly, as though it were some trivial piece of paper. "This looks fake," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "People like you think you can get away with anything." Brianna blinked, stunned. "Fake? Sir, I don't understand. That's my ID. It's valid. If there's an issue, you can check it in your system." "I don't need your advice on how to do my job," he snapped, cutting her off. The weight of his glare pressed down on her, but she kept her voice level. "Officer, please. I'm not trying to—" Before she could finish, he raised his hand, holding her ID between his fingers like it was trash. Then, to her absolute horror, he pulled a lighter from his pocket. Brianna's breath caught as she realized what was about to happen. "Maybe this'll teach you a lesson," he sneered. In one fluid motion, he flicked the lighter, and the small flame danced dangerously close to her ID. "Wait, you can't," Brianna started, her voice rising, but it was too late. The flame caught the edge of the card, and within seconds it was curling and blackening in his hand. The acrid smell of burning plastic filled the air as he dropped the charred remains onto the pavement at her feet. Brianna stared, frozen in disbelief. Her voice came out in a whisper, trembling with a mix of shock and anger. "Why would you do that?" The officer smirked again, his expression smug and unapologetic. "Next time, bring something real," he said coldly. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Brianna sitting there, stunned and speechless. As his car roared back to life and sped off into the night, Brianna's hands trembled on the steering wheel. She looked down at the crumpled, burned remains of her ID lying on the asphalt, her mind reeling. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was personal. It was targeted. And it was wrong. The initial shock began to melt into something else. Resolve. Brianna grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she opened the dashcam app she'd installed years ago. It had been recording the entire time, capturing everything: his words, his actions, his blatant disregard for justice. She played back a snippet of the footage, her jaw tightening as she listened to his mocking tone. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been humiliated, intimidated, or dehumanized by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. But even as the weight of what had just happened sank in, Brianna knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let this slide. Brianna sat in her car for a moment, the silence pressing heavily around her. Her mind was racing, but her actions were deliberate. She picked up her phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. "Elliot, it's me," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Elliot was not just her attorney. He was a trusted friend who had stood by her through countless legal battles. She recounted what had just happened, her tone calm but firm as she explained every detail. "That's not just misconduct," Elliot said after a pause. "That's blatant abuse of power. You've got the dashcam footage, right?" "Yes," Brianna replied. It recorded everything. His words, his actions, the lighter. Her voice faltered slightly at the memory of the ID burning in front of her. "Good," Elliot said, his voice reassuring. "Don't worry, we're going to handle this. He messed with the wrong person." Brianna ended the call and took a moment to compose herself. The thought of her children waiting at home gave her strength. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about ensuring a better future for them, free from the fear of being unfairly targeted. The next morning, Elliot filed a formal complaint with the police department, attaching the dashcam footage as evidence. Brianna's story quickly gained traction, spreading through local news outlets. Reporters reached out for interviews, while community leaders voiced their outrage. Soon, the officer's identity was revealed, and his history of misconduct came to light. Complaints of similar behavior had been buried for years, but now, under the weight of public scrutiny, they resurfaced. Brianna's case was no longer just hers. It became a rallying point for the community. Protests erupted outside the police station, demanding accountability not just for this officer, but for the entire department. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Brianna" and "End Racial Profiling" filled the streets. Brianna, ever composed, spoke to the crowd during one such rally. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "This is about every person who has been mistreated because someone thought they could get away with it. We're here to say enough is enough." The legal process moved forward, slow but steady. The officer was placed on administrative leave, and Brianna prepared to testify in court. But the weight of the fight wasn't hers alone. Support poured in from strangers, civil rights organizations, and even other law enforcement officers who condemned the abuse of power. But even as the case gained momentum, Brianna knew the fight wasn't just about winning in court. It was about changing the system. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Brianna sat at the witness stand, her head held high as she recounted the events of that night with clarity and poise. The dashcam footage played on a large screen, the officer's smirk and the flicker of the lighter stark reminders of the abuse she endured. Gasps rippled through the room as the recording reached its crescendo, the ID burning in his hand and his mocking words echoing in the silent chamber. When the officer's defense tried to argue that his actions were misjudged but not malicious, Brianna's attorney countered with the hard facts. A pattern of complaints against the officer, his disregard for protocol, and the undeniable footage of his actions. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was clear: guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. The officer was dismissed from the force, and the department issued a formal apology to Brianna. Yet for her, this victory was only part of the larger battle. She used the settlement she received to establish a legal aid fund for victims of racial profiling, ensuring that others who found themselves in her position wouldn't have to face it alone. The case sparked a nationwide conversation about the unchecked power of law enforcement. Brianna was invited to speak on panels, her voice becoming a beacon for change. "Accountability isn't just about punishment," she said in one interview. "It's about rebuilding trust. It's about ensuring that no one else has to experience what I did." Months later, Brianna drove down that same stretch of road, this time with her kids in the back seat. Her youngest was singing off-key to a song on the radio, and her oldest was telling a story about school. As they passed the intersection where it all happened, she glanced at the spot briefly, then focused back on the road ahead. She'd turned that moment of humiliation into a movement for justice, and that thought gave her peace. To those watching, Brianna's story isn't just a tale of one woman's resilience, it's a call to action. It's a reminder that silence allows injustice to thrive, but one voice, backed by determination, can create waves of change. If her story moved you, take a moment to think about how you can make a difference in your own community. Whether it's supporting organizations fighting for justice, holding those in power accountable, or simply educating yourself, every action matters. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change and spark important conversations. Together, we can create a better world.